I was standing in the grand ballroom at the Street Regis in Atlanta where my son's engagement party was being held, when I overheard the future bride whispering to her mother about so-called social status, about her absolute contempt for her backwoods future father-in-law. The exact words were that filthy old hillbilly. Have you ever heard the sound of your heart breaking? Not the sharp crack of the crystal glasses on the banquet tables around me. I mean the sound of a father's dignity shattering. I just stood there in the middle of that magnificent hall beneath the blinding glow of crystal chandeliers. My old suit from the 1990s suddenly looked ridiculous among the designer evening gowns. My hands, the same hands that had grown rough and calloused after 40 years of digging into the red soil of Georgia, were trembling. I tried to hide them in my pockets, but I couldn't. The smell of expensive perfume was suffocating. It was nothing like the scent of hay and damp earth after a summer rain on the farm. Cassandra Sterling stood there looking like an angel painted on a church ceiling. But the words coming out of those crimson lips were pure poison. She had no idea I was standing right behind her. She turned to her mother Deborah and let out a mocking laugh. The older woman raised a silk handkerchief to her mouth while staring at me the way someone looks at a stain on a marble floor. They thought I was stupid. They thought this old farmer couldn't understand the polished language of high society. For a moment I almost turned around and walked out. I wanted to go home. Back to the quiet of the farm. The place where kindness isn't measured by the thickness of a man's wallet. But just then a firm hand landed on my shoulder. It was Malcolm. My son. He looked straight into my eyes. There was no embarrassment. No hesitation. Just a strange, cold calm. He leaned close to my ear and whispered in a low, razor-sharp voice, "Easy, Dad. Tomorrow I'll take everything back." I stared at him, the boy I had raised with sweat and sacrifice after his mother died. And for the first time I saw something different in his eyes. This wasn't simple anger. It was a plan, a punishment that had already been prepared. What I didn't realize at that moment was that my son's plan was far more devastating than anything I could imagine. But before I tell you what happened next, let me introduce myself. My name is Eli. I'm a farmer who believes that a promise is a contract written in stone, one that should never be broken. And the Sterling family is about to learn the most expensive lesson of their lives. They underestimated an old man who loves his land more than gold. And they made a terrible mistake when they crossed the final line with my son. This story isn't just about betrayal. It's about a reversal so brutal that no one in that glittering ballroom could have predicted it. So stay with me, because what happened in the shadows of that old farm will completely change the way you think about loyalty. Welcome back to Dad's Real-Life Revenge. To understand why Cassandra's insult cut so deeply, you have to understand where I come from. I wasn't born into silk and privilege. I was born from the red soil of Georgia. My farm isn't just property. It's sweat. It's blood. It's the place where I buried Sarah, my late wife. Sarah always said my hands were the most beautiful hands in the world, even though they were scarred and rough. She used to say they were the hands of an honest man. After she passed, Malcolm was all I had left. I raised him among endless cornfields. I taught him that a man's value is measured by his word, not by the size of his bank account. I was proud when Malcolm became successful in the city. But I never imagined he would bring home someone like Cassandra Sterling. The first time I met her family was at their mansion in Greenwich. It was the kind of place where the cold seemed to seep out of the stone walls themselves. Wallace Sterling shook my hand with a careless grip. His hand was soft and slippery. His eyes looked at me the way someone looks at an outdated piece of furniture that needs to be thrown away. Deborah stood beside him, glittering with jewelry, but her smile never once reached her eyes. They asked about the size of my farm. They asked about land ownership. At the time, I thought they were simply interested in the family their daughter was marrying into. So I told them honestly about the land my ancestors left me. I told them about the highway project that was expected to run through that area. That's when I saw a flash in Wallace's eyes. It wasn't warmth. It was hunger. But I was too naive to see it. I thought it was shared excitement. Cassandra even pretended to care about my health back then. She promised she would take care of Malcolm and love the farm like a second home. My father used to tell me to be careful of people who smile too brightly before they truly know you. I should have remembered that lesson. Instead, I let my son fall into the trap of a snake with flawless skin and a voice as sweet as honey. But out in the countryside we have a way of dealing with snakes. We don't strike them immediately. We wait until they crawl completely out of their hole. I thought I was preparing for a wedding. In reality, I was preparing for a war of survival. And the question that haunted me was this: could a single old farmer stand against people who use money to bend the truth? And Malcolm, my own son, whose side was he really on in this game filled with lies? After that humiliating engagement party, Malcolm led me out to the parking lot. The Atlanta night was windy, but sweat was still running down my forehead. I wanted to yell at him. I wanted to demand an answer. I wanted to know why he had stood there and allowed that woman to insult his own father. But Malcolm didn't say a word. He guided me into the car and locked the doors. Then he pulled out a small voice recorder. His face was hard-carved like granite. He looked straight at me and said only one thing: "Dad, just listen." The recording began to play. There was a brief hiss of static, and then a familiar voice came through the speaker. Cassandra. Her voice was no longer sweet like honey. It was sharp, calculating. "That old man is a fool. He'll sign anything his son asks him to." Then came her laughter. Cold. The kind of laughter that makes your skin crawl. A moment later, Wallace's voice cut in. "We need that land for the highway development. Once he signs the power of attorney, 18% of the profit from this flip goes straight into our pockets." Cassandra replied with smug confidence. "Don't worry, Dad. Malcolm is completely under my control. After the wedding, that farm will belong to the Sterling family." It felt like an invisible hand was tightening around my throat. They didn't want to welcome a father into their family. They wanted to swallow the land that Sarah had spent her entire life caring for. To them, I was nothing more than a cheap pawn on their banquet table. The blood in my veins began to boil. My anger started to push past the pain. I turned to Malcolm. "When did you find out about this?" Malcolm gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He admitted he had suspected something for a long time. He had secretly planted recording devices in Wallace's office and in Cassandra's private room. That was the moment I realized my son wasn't weak. He had been quietly enduring the humiliation, collecting evidence. He wasn't just protecting the farm. He was protecting our family's honor. He told me the Sterling family had forged countless documents to steal land from other poor farmers. That night I couldn't sleep. I stared at my calloused hands. Those people believed money could buy anything. They believed an old country farmer would be easily crushed by complicated contracts and legal tricks. But they made one terrible mistake. They believed an old lion no longer knew where his claws were. Malcolm's plan slowly began to reveal itself. He had already contacted Tyrone, one of the top audio technicians in the region. Together they were preparing a very special surprise for the upcoming wedding. A gift that would turn Cassandra's happiest day into the worst nightmare of her life. I can feel the truth inside those recordings burning through my patience, and I know you can feel it too. So make sure you subscribe to the channel right now, because you won't want to miss the moment justice is finally served in the next chapter. The waiting won't last much longer, because that wedding altar is about to turn into a guillotine for the greedy. The 3 days before the wedding felt like the longest days of my life. I went back to the farm. I stood in front of Sarah's grave and whispered to her that I would protect everything we had built together. Malcolm wasn't with me anymore. He was in the city finishing the final pieces of the plan. I met Tyrone at a small roadside diner. Tyrone was a young man with sharp eyes and the kind of hands that seemed like magic when he worked with electronics. He was the AV technician the Sterling family had hired to handle the sound and lighting for their $1 million wedding. They hired him because he was the best. But what they didn't know was that he had been Malcolm's closest friend since college. Tyrone slid a tablet across the table toward me. He smiled, but there was anger burning behind his eyes. On the screen he showed me how he had already accessed the presentation system at the Street Regis Hotel. He had quietly embedded the incriminating recordings right into the middle of the romantic video montage about Malcolm and Cassandra's love story. The bomb had already been planted. All it needed now was a single button. Tyrone told me something else. The Sterling family had even prepared a fake contract. They planned to trick me into signing it during the dinner reception after the wedding, when I would supposedly be drunk with celebration and pride for my son. The document would immediately transfer 18% of the farm's value to them before the highway project was publicly announced. Their greed had no limits. It was like a black hole that swallowed every trace of morality. I looked at the guest list. It was filled with powerful names: politicians, investors, people the Sterling family desperately wanted to impress. They wanted this wedding to polish their reputation. But what they didn't realize was that those same distinguished guests would soon become witnesses to their collapse. Malcolm called me on the final night. His voice was strangely calm. He told me to wear my best suit. He told me to walk into that wedding hall with my head held high. Don't be afraid. Don't doubt anything. Later that night, I sat alone on the dark porch of the farmhouse. The cornfields whispered in the wind. I knew that after tomorrow, our lives would never be the same again. Our honor would be washed clean by the truth. But I still felt a chill run down my spine when I imagined the moment that truth would explode in front of dozens of powerful figures and hundreds of camera lenses. Would the Sterling family still have a way out once their darkest secret was exposed? Or would they try to use their power to extinguish the fire we had just lit? I'm truly glad you stayed with me this far to hear the story. Now I want to ask you something. Do you think the Sterling family deserves a second chance? Or is public punishment the price they must pay for a scheme that tried to trade human dignity for wealth? Comment number 1 if you believe justice should be served. Comment number 2 if you think they deserve a second chance. That day the sun was shining in a strangely beautiful way. But inside me there was only a terrifying calm. I sat in the very first row on the groom's side. Alone. The seat beside me was empty. It was meant for Sarah. And somehow I could almost feel her warmth beside me, as if she were telling me to stay strong. The church was decorated with thousands of pure white roses. A perfect illusion of purity. Cassandra walked down the aisle wearing a magnificent wedding gown worth tens of thousands of dollars. She smiled brightly at the guests. But when her eyes passed over me, I saw it again. The contempt. Still there, hidden beneath layers of expensive makeup. Deborah sat across the aisle. She looked at me the way someone might stare at a strange creature that had wandered into a flock of swans. Wallace, meanwhile, was busy shaking hands with investors. He was laughing cheerfully. Perhaps he was already calculating how much money he would make from my land once their little scheme succeeded. The pastor began the ceremony. His voice echoed through the church. Then the most important moment arrived. The pastor turned to Malcolm. "Do you take Cassandra to be your wife?" The room fell completely silent. Malcolm didn't answer right away. He turned and looked at me. Then he looked back at Cassandra. Malcolm took one step backward. He reached over and took the microphone from the pastor's hand. His voice rang out sharp and clear. "Pastor, before I answer that question, there's something everyone here needs to see." A murmur spread through the crowd. Wallace jumped to his feet. He tried to stop it, but it was already too late. Tyrone had pressed the button. The giant screen behind the altar, the one meant to display wedding photos, suddenly went dark. Then a title appeared in blood-red letters. The truth about Cassandra Sterling and her family. The entire room held its breath. The video began to play. But instead of romantic memories, the screen showed hidden camera footage. There was Cassandra laughing and mocking me at the street Regis. Her voice echoed across the church. "That filthy old man will never even realize he's losing his land." Then came the conversation about the highway project. The plan to steal 18% of the illegal profits. The elegant faces in the church began to change. Whispers spread through the crowd like a wildfire. Cassandra stood frozen in place. The bouquet slipped from her hands and fell onto the stone floor. White petals were crushed under the feet of guests who were beginning to panic. Her face turned from pale to gray. Humiliation slowly seeped into every inch of the arrogant woman standing at the altar. I could almost feel the satisfaction building in the room as the lies were exposed. This was the moment when the truth stopped being just words. It became a death sentence for the Sterling family's reputation. But the collapse had only just begun. The entire church exploded in shock. Guests in expensive suits jumped to their feet. The murmurs that had begun as whispers quickly turned into angry shouting. The admiration people once had for the Sterling family vanished in an instant, replaced by looks of pure contempt. Wallace Sterling rushed toward the technical booth. He was screaming, demanding that the screen be shut off. But Tyrone had already disappeared after locking the entire system. The images on the screen continued to play. Now they showed forged contracts with carefully manipulated signatures. proof of how the Sterling family had pushed dozens of farming families into ruin long before they ever came after me. Deborah could barely stand. She clutched the back of a chair as her expensive silk handkerchief slipped from her hand and fell to the floor. She tried to hide her face from the camera flashes erupting from the journalists among the guests. The pride of a high society lady had completely dissolved. In the middle of that chaos, Cassandra suddenly collapsed to her knees. Her magnificent wedding gown now looked like a cocoon trapping the liar inside it. She crawled toward Malcolm, crying hysterically, "Malcolm, please. It's all a misunderstanding. I was forced into it." But Malcolm stepped back. There was no trace of love left in his eyes, only deep disgust. His voice echoed through the church. "You never loved me. You only loved my father's land. You weren't marrying me. You were marrying 18% of the profit from that highway project." At that moment, a middle-aged man stood up from the back row. It was Philip Wells, a famous attorney known throughout the state as the iron arm of the prosecution. He calmly walked toward the pulpit. No one had invited him. But the moment he stepped forward, the entire room fell silent. Philip looked directly at Wallace Sterling. His voice was calm but heavy with threat. "What I just witnessed here is not simply a romantic scandal. It constitutes attempted large-scale fraud and document forgery under state law. As a prosecutor, I cannot ignore something like this," Wallace stammered. "You think you can threaten me, Wells?" Only smiled coldly. Then he pulled out his phone. "I called the county police 10 minutes ago. They're already waiting at the front gate." I stood there, staring at the ruins of $1 million wedding. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something else. A strange kind of peace. At last, the truth was no longer buried beneath the red soil of Georgia. But what I didn't realize yet was that my son's plan was even more devastating than this. He didn't just want the Sterling family to lose face. He wanted them to pay with their freedom. The sound of police sirens wailed outside the church. It tore through the suffocating air of the ceremony. The heavy oak doors were pushed open and a group of state troopers stepped inside with cold expressions. There would be no mercy here. No special treatment for the wealthy. Cassandra was still kneeling on the floor. She looked up at the uniformed officers with hollow, stunned eyes. The small crown on her head had slipped to one side. Strands of her golden hair were sticking to her face, damp with sweat and tears. She no longer looked like a bride. She looked like a criminal cornered at the end of the road. Wallace Sterling made one final attempt to reclaim his authority. He shouted loudly, "Do you have any idea who I am?" But one of the officers stepped forward. He didn't say a single word. He simply pulled out a pair of shining steel handcuffs. The cold click echoed through the church as they locked around Wallace's wrists. That sound marked the end of an empire built on deception. Deborah let out a scream and collapsed to the floor. But no one rushed to help her. The guests who had once crowded around the family with flattery were now stepping away as if avoiding a contagious disease. They were afraid of being connected to the scandal, afraid their own names might appear in the headlines alongside these fraudsters. The loyalty of high society is often as fragile as an eggshell. I watched as the officers began escorting Cassandra away. Two of them lifted her to her feet. Her magnificent wedding gown dragged across the floor, catching on broken flower vases and soaking up spilled water. The white fabric was now smeared with dirt and stains. Cassandra screamed Malcolm's name. She begged for forgiveness. But Malcolm stood where he was, his arms folded across his chest, his face calm and still like the surface of a quiet lake. He had waited 735 days for this moment. 2 long years of living inside a lie, all to prepare a single decisive strike. He watched Cassandra being pushed into the police car without blinking. Philip Wells walked over and stood beside me. He placed a hand on my shoulder and spoke softly, "Mr. Eli, it's over." I nodded, but my heart still felt heavy. Justice had arrived. Yet the price for it was the loss of the naive trust I once carried in this world. The Sterling family was led away through a storm of camera flashes. Journalists had originally come to cover what was supposed to be the wedding of the year. Now they had a story far more explosive. The collapse of a prestigious dynasty, right at the altar. But what I didn't realize at that moment was that my son's plan was even bigger than this. Malcolm didn't just want them arrested. He had already prepared other witnesses. people who had been victims just like me, but who had never had a voice. This was an expensive lesson for anyone who believes they can step on the poor to climb higher. Tell me honestly, did you feel a sense of satisfaction when those handcuffs snapped shut on Wallace's wrists? If you've stayed with this story until now, do us a quick favor. Hit subscribe. A lot of people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing, and it helps you stay updated with the newest and most powerful stories on this channel. And if you think the drama ended here, you're mistaken. What you just saw was only a small part of the Sterling family's plans. The real trial will reveal the whole truth. The scandal at the St. Regis wedding wasn't just another piece of entertainment news. It was more like a small crack in a massive dam. And once that crack split open, the truth began pouring out like a flood. When the Sterling family was taken into the police station, they still believed money and influence could make everything disappear. But they were wrong. Malcolm had prepared a much larger network of justice than I had ever imagined. When news of Cassandra's arrest spread across social media, other victims began to appear. People whose voices had once been silenced by confidentiality agreements and threats from the Sterling family's lawyers. The first to come forward was Candace White, a thin woman with tired eyes full of sorrow. She had once owned a small farm in Savannah. The Sterling family had used tactics similar to the ones they tried on me to force her to sell her land for a fraction of its value. When she refused, they staged a legal dispute that eventually bankrupted her. After her came 4 more families. They gathered together under the guidance of attorney Philip Wells. They carried stacks of old documents, fragments of evidence they had protected for years, hoping that someday justice might finally arrive. I sat in the courthouse waiting room and watched those farmers. In their faces I saw myself, calloused hands, wrinkled skin marked by years of hard work. None of us were people chasing fast wealth. We only wanted to protect the land that had fed our families for generations. The trial unfolded under intense public scrutiny. Wallace Sterling tried to remain calm, but his hands trembled constantly as he listened to the powerful testimonies against him. Cassandra, on the other hand, was completely broken. The elegance of a wealthy socialite had vanished. She sat there hunched over, facing the very people she once called filthy country peasants. One by one, the recordings Malcolm had collected were played in court. Every conversation, every scheme, every calculation. The illegal 18% profit they planned to steal was laid out piece by piece. The judge stared at the Sterling family with the sternest expression I had ever seen. He said their greed had blinded their morality, and the price they would pay would match the pain they had inflicted on others. As I watched the scene unfold, a chill ran down my spine. Truth carries a terrifying kind of power when it is finally brought into the light. It doesn't just punish the guilty, it heals the wounded. But what amazed me most was that my son's plan didn't end there. Malcolm wasn't only trying to reclaim our land. He had secretly arranged for every dollar stolen by the Sterling family to be redirected into a fund that supports farmers who lost their land through illegal seizures. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like the nervous beating of a frightened heart. Wallace Sterling sat there. No elegant suit. No powerful threats. He looked as if he had aged 10 years overnight. His face was gray like cold ashes. Deborah kept sobbing quietly into her handkerchief, but no one felt the slightest sympathy anymore. Cassandra sat completely still. Her eyes were fixed on her hands locked together by a pair of steel handcuffs. Those same hands that only weeks earlier had dreamed of diamonds and millions of dollars from their land scheme. The judge cleared his throat. The entire courtroom fell silent. Then he began to read the verdict. Each word echoed through the room like the strike of a hammer sealing the coffin of greed. For the charges of organized fraud, forgery of official documents, and conspiracy to seize property on a large scale. He paused. Wallace Sterling, 12 years in prison. No bail. A broken sound escaped Wallace's throat as he collapsed forward onto the table. Deborah Sterling, 8 years in prison as an active accomplice. And finally, Cassandra Sterling for orchestrating the romantic deception used to carry out the scheme, 10 years in prison. Cassandra screamed and collapsed. She looked toward Malcolm with one final desperate plea in her eyes. But my son remained standing. His gaze was cold and steady, like a god of justice delivering judgment. He didn't turn away. He wanted to witness the fall of the person who had once mocked his father. All of the Sterling family's illegal assets were frozen. Their mansion in Greenwich would be auctioned off to compensate the victims. The highway project would still move forward, but now the 18% profit would no longer flow into the pockets of fraudsters. Instead, it would be distributed among the farming families who had spent their lives protecting their land. I looked out through the courthouse window. Golden sunlight stretched across the ground. Justice had finally been served. Those who believed money could bend the truth had learned the most expensive lesson of their lives. A person's honor is not something that can be bought or sold. Malcolm didn't just reclaim justice for me. He forced the entire financial world to tremble before the power of the truth. He proved that a farmer and his son could shake an entire empire, if they had enough patience. The sound of the judge's gavel was still echoing in my mind as we drove back to Georgia. The iron gates of the farm appeared under the golden light of sunset. The smell of soil and dry grass wrapped around me like the warm embrace of an old friend. I took a deep breath. This was what freedom truly felt like. Malcolm never went back to the city. He decided to stay and rebuild everything with me. The farm was no longer threatened by the shadows of greedy people. The highway project had been adjusted. We didn't sell the land. Instead, we partnered with the developers to turn the place into a sustainable agricultural model. One afternoon, Malcolm brought someone home. Her name was Emily. She was a teacher at the local elementary school. Emily had gentle eyes and hands that weren't afraid to touch the soil. She looked at the farm with genuine respect. Not because of its million-dollar value, but because of the stories and the sweat that had been poured into this land. I watched the two of them walking together through the fields, and somehow I knew Sarah was smiling from above. We had protected her legacy. We had proven that kindness can defeat cunning. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Never ignore your instincts. Trust yourself even when the whole world tries to make you doubt. Protecting what belongs to you is not selfish. It's dignity. And never be afraid to stand up for the truth, no matter how powerful or wealthy your opponent may be. Life can be cruel sometimes, but it is always fair to those who endure. The Sterling family lost everything because they underestimated the very values that matter most. And we regained everything because we never abandoned our roots. Do you think this is the most satisfying ending possible? If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Many people watch without doing it, but it costs you nothing and it helps you stay connected to the most powerful and authentic stories. Stories where truth quietly defeats deception. Stories where patience, strategy, and courage bring justice to broken families. And as always, thank you for being part of this space. Thank you for listening. Stay strong on your own path. Goodbye for now, and I'll see you again in the next story on Dad's Real Life Revenge.